They thought the party was for me. The real surprise had my fingerprints all over it. I kept my hand steady on the wheel and let the city slide past in quiet ribbons, tail lights, rain pooling at intersections, the faint smear of neon on wet asphalt. 32 isn't an age that needs confetti. It's an age that notices the corners of things, the way a promise curls at the edges when it's been touched too many times, how a laugh can be bright and still feel hollow. My name is Elena. I make lists I don't show anyone, I iron the sleeves of my shirts and fold them the same way every week, and I don't raise my voice to people who would enjoy it. The invitation came from my sister, Mara, 3 days ago, a text with too many exclamation points, sent at midnight like she was tossing glitter into a quiet room. She said, "Surprise party for your birthday. Everyone's coming. You'll love it." She meant our mother, our uncles, the cousins who perform memory like a talent show, the aunt who keeps score in whispers. She meant neighbors I once babysat for and the kind of friends who prefer crowded rooms because silence is confrontational. I replied, "You didn't have to." She said, "I wanted to." What she wanted was a stage. Mara is 29 and born for rooms that applaud. She has the kind of beauty that gathers its own weather, and the kind of hunger that stands on the balcony and checks if anyone is watching. I am the older sister who fetches the glasses and notices the nail heads poking up from the porch. I am good with numbers, and secrets make more sense to me than gossip. At the stoplight on Harlow and 3rd, I touched the pocket of my coat. The envelope was thin enough to be forgettable. It held 3 pages, 2 signatures, a notary stamp, and the smallest drop of relief I'd allowed myself in months. The paper had a mild texture, like a whisper you could feel with your hands. When I slid it into the inside pocket that morning, I thought of how my grandmother used to tuck handkerchiefs into her cardigan sleeve, effortless, habitual, a softness hidden in plain sight. I saw the sign for the river and thought of the phone call that started this particular branch of the story. It was early spring then, damp and gull-colored, when Mom's voice crackled through like she was calling from under a quilt. She said she'd signed something for Mara, something to simplify things. Her words felt slippery. Later, I'd see the scan, a power of attorney drafted with cheerful business language and a signature that sat just a fraction lower than all the others Mom had ever made, as if it were trying to hide under them. I printed it and held it beside older documents like you hold 2 hands up to the light to see which one is warmer. Mara kept saying it was temporary. She said, "I'm just helping Mom with errands. Doctors, mail, that stuff. You're so busy with work." She framed it like a relief, a kindness, a favor you don't deserve but are given. I am not a lawyer, but I read slowly and I don't stop because I'm bored. The little lines that tuck into the bottom of a page mean nearly everything. So when the surprise party text arrived, when she set the location at Mom's house and took over, when she told me to wear something fun, I pictured her smile as a gate. She would gather everyone, the soft witnesses and the loud ones, and she would let gossip do the lifting. I have learned that in my family, the biggest lie always comes with a sheet cake and a toast. The sky spit a light rain that made the road look tender. I let myself think about cake so I wouldn't have to think about what I'd found last week, the withdrawals, the peculiar transfers, the quick shifting titles that clicked through county records like someone impatiently flipping a charm bracelet. Mom's house had been paid off since the year I left for college. Suddenly there were documents that made it seem like the house owed apologies. There are people who would scream. I made tea and sat with the cursor blinking until it felt like breathing. Then I printed what could be printed and put it in the envelope. I called no one. Not yet. Quiet can be a strategy if you hold it carefully in your hands and don't mistake it for surrender. I drove past the library where the summer reading program stickered my childhood books like they were passports, past the closed tailor shop where Mr. Yoon tucked pins with the patience of a monk. This is the part of the city where memory stacks itself politely, where nothing is new and everything has a name. I passed a bus stop where a girl in a red coat scrolled on her phone and lifted the corner of a smile at something I'd never know. It comforted me to think there were stories that didn't touch mine. When I turned onto our street, the house glowed like it knew a camera was pointed at it. The porch light was on too early, the living room shades drawn but breathing. Cars lined the curb like commas. Mara always over-invites and then apologizes for the crowd she created, as if she were caught in a natural disaster. I parked a few houses down and sat for a moment with the engine off, the rain picking at the windshield. My phone buzzed. She said, "Where are you?" "Almost ready?" I replied, "1 minute." When I stepped out, the cold was precise. I chose flat shoes over heels because I wanted to feel the ground. My coat was slate gray and the envelope pressed against my ribs like a promise you don't say aloud. The porch steps creaked in the places I predicted. My key was in my hand because old habits tug harder in old houses. Through the curtain slit, I caught a flicker, someone moving quickly, then still. I smelled something lemony, cleaner than our house ever really was. I swallowed a laugh. Surprises need a certain innocence to land, a belief that the people in your life will only ever try to please you. I could act. I knew how to widen my eyes without overplaying. It's a talent I've cultivated in rooms where my sister introduces me to people like I'm her pet accomplishment. "This is Elena, she's the serious one." I was the serious one when Grandma died and the casseroles arrived and Mara posed beside the dining table like a hostess in a magazine. I was the serious one when Mom's doctor wrote mild cognitive impairment on a file and Mara declared it alarmist. I was serious when I found the draft deed transfer with the wrong middle initial for Mom and compared it to a check with her careful, curved letters that hadn't wavered in 6 decades. I was serious when I watched a video of Mara coaxing Mom to sign just one more form and saw the way Mom's eyes kept sliding toward the door like they were following someone else. The bell had been replaced since I moved out. It chimed like a door to a spa. I stood very still and counted my breaths. Someone giggled. Someone whispered, "Shoo." The porch's sweet rot smell, wet wood, old potting soil, rose around me like fog. I thought of the one time I found Mom crying at the kitchen sink, impotent tears sliding down her cheeks as if they didn't belong to anyone. She said, "Don't make trouble." She meant with Mara. She meant keep the air clear enough to breathe. I turned the knob. It didn't move. I waited a beat, then knocked lightly. Footsteps, hurried and theatrical, approached from inside. A hush fell with almost comic speed. I stared at the brass of the doorknob, the small scratch as a map of everyone who had ever tried to enter this house with groceries and keys in their mouth and winter on their coat. The door opened a crack. Mara's eye filled the space, bright as a pilot light. She whispered, okay, go back down." Then louder, sing-song, pitched for the choir, "She's here." The door closed again. I heard frenzied shuffling, the misplacement of a lighter, someone saying they forgot the knife, a baby making a soft staccato of complaint. There are performances that begin before the audience arrives. My sister loves those best. I waited for the second opening. It came 5 seconds later, wide and sweeping, Mara framed by the hall light, wearing a dress the color of the inside of a peach and a lipstick I recognized from my own bathroom counter. She said, "Surprise." Lights flared. People exploded into the room with the relief of being allowed to. A banner drooped at a polite angle, a cake, large enough to feed an apology tour, sat under a cloche. Mom was perched on the arm of the couch, smaller than I remembered, her cardigan buttoned wrong. She clapped with the uncertain rhythm of a child trying not to fail. I made the face. Open mouth, hand to chest, eyes lifting, tiny laugh like a bubble escaping. People laughed with me as if they'd been generous. Mara kissed my cheek and managed to whisper into my ear at the same time, "Wait till you see. Everyone's here." Everyone used to mean our father, but he'd moved his fresh start to Arizona and a yoga teacher 15 years ago. I scanned the room out of instinct, looking for the past like it might have wandered in by accident. Instead, I found an array of present-day acquaintances, a neighbor who had once scolded me for not planting the right azaleas, 2 of Mara's friends who dressed like they could run for office and win on charisma alone. My boss was there, which is a kind of violence. Mara had reached farther than blood tonight. She wanted witnesses who were qualified to believe her. She took my coat with a flourish and nearly brushed the envelope. I stepped back and kept my hand on the pocket, casual to anyone not looking hard. She pivoted immediately to her stage directions. The music turned low, the cake migrated to the dining table where Grandma's crystal dish had become a bowl of yellow jelly beans, and the room pressed close around me like a curious animal. There were the rehearsed compliments: "You look radiant, 32 looks good on you, we should do this more often," that sounded like placeholders for the thing no one wanted to say. Mara moved through the crowd like a conductor, channeling attention. She led me to Mom, whose smile was out late and wanting to go home. I knelt a little so I could meet her where she was. She whispered, "It's for you." The tip of her finger brushed my cheekbone, a small gesture that nearly unstrung me. I answered, "I know, Mom." Mara clapped her hands and people quieted as if we were in church and she had become the lector. She said, "Before we cut the cake." The room obeyed, the way rooms do when they're waiting for a good story. She loved beginnings more than endings, they offered more kindling for applause. She smiled with her teeth. "I wanted to take a second to tell you all why this year is extra special." She paused. A ripple went through the guests, a consensual inhale. "Elena is not just another year wiser, she's also about to make a big decision. A family decision." Heads turned, searching my face for a cue. I held my breath, then let it go slowly, not because I was nervous but because it made time behave. She continued, softer now, the way a snake lowers itself before it uncoils. "As you all know, well, we've all been pitching in." She looked at me like a spotlight pretending to be moonlight. "But big sisters are big sisters for a reason, and Elena's going to help us make sure everything is just handled." The word slid into me with the cold finesse of a slim knife. There it was, the trap disguised as a toast. A public promise I hadn't made, shaped to fit the mouth that said it. People nodded, practiced nods that meant, "Daughters do this." Maybe one or two glanced at me with sympathy like a fringe on a scarf. My boss smiled, proud to see me assigned a duty I hadn't accepted. Mom blinked, confused at being both present and absent in the same sentence. I kept my face gentle, because righteousness is uglier than a lie in rooms like this. I folded my hands. Mara went on, telling a story about sisters, one wild, one steady, about balance, about love. There was applause, soft clapping that may as well have been the sound of wet paper. The cake knife appeared in her hand as if conjured. I studied the polished edge and the way it flashed in the chandelier light like an unspoken threat. She placed the knife in my palm and curled my fingers around it. Her perfume smelled like a garden trying a little too hard. She said, "Make a wish." I thought of wishes like pins in a cushion, bright and useless unless you need to sew something shut. I inhaled. The envelope pressed into my ribs, the 3 pages hummed with their own small gravity. My eyes found Mom again. She smiled because someone else smiled. I leaned toward the cake. 32 candles, because Mara loves math when it means spectacle. The flame heat lifted toward my face, and in that warm shimmer I saw a version of myself who had believed families were houses with strong roofs. The air smelled like sugar pretending to be love. I closed my eyes and let my breath gather. The doorbell rang. Not the spa chime, but the old, blunted ding-dong of a doorbell that no longer existed in this house. It rang again, insistently, like memory choosing its own entrance. People shifted. Mara's gaze flicked toward the hallway, irritation crossing her face and correcting itself before it could stick. She nodded at one of her friends, a glossy shadow in a navy dress, to go answer it. "Ignore it," she said, and laughed too brightly. "Candles first." But the hallway filled with voices, low at first, then carrying, then unmistakable. The kind of voices that belong to rooms you didn't invite into yours unless you had to. A shape moved toward us, taller than any of the men in the living room, the kind of presence that erases small talk. For a second, no one breathed. The cake flame trembled, and the knife suddenly felt heavier in my hand. And then, from the hall, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 10 years say my name like it still owned the right, "Elena?" The room turned to look at him as if pulled by a tide, and Mara's smile froze so cleanly it might have cracked if someone touched it. His name tore open a room I had welded shut. I didn't drop the knife. He stood in the hallway like a wrong season, too bright, too warm, dressed for weather we didn't have. The candles threw moving shadows on his face and made him look younger in a way that wasn't kind. People shifted to make a path because that's what people do around certainty, even when it's counterfeit. I felt my breath go small and efficient, the way it does when you carry a heavy box upstairs and you know there's no point looking up until you reach the landing. He said my name again, softer this time, and the syllables reached for me like hands through water. I didn't answer. The cake kept burning delicately in front of me. The envelope at my ribs felt heavier, as if it knew this changed its job. Sound narrowed, a baby's short hiccup sobs, a spoon pinging porcelain in the kitchen, the wet sizzle of a candle stuttering. The room smelled like sugar and lemon cleaner and a wet coat, the kind of domestic chord our house always played when something important was about to be avoided. Mara's breath ticked against my shoulder. She was still smiling for the room, a stage-lit version of herself, but the muscle beside her I kept tightening like a small fist. I looked at Mom. She watched him with the polite confusion of seeing a neighbor out of context, like finding your barber at a funeral. Her hand flattened on the couch arm as if she were smoothing fabric. The cardigan was still buttoned wrong. I reached over and released the top button with my thumb. The space under her collarbone looked too empty. Grandma would have had words for this exact kind of moment, though she would have kept them sheathed behind a careful face. She taught me that people are weather, not laws. You go out prepared, and you don't waste time arguing with the rain. She stacked her life in small, tidy rituals, bread dough on Sundays, sweeping the porch every evening, letters answered the same day they arrived. She stored loose safety pins in a chipped saucer shaped like a leaf, and when she mended something you couldn't tell where the damage had been unless you knew the garment well. I grew into the person who wants to know the garment well. I learned my handwriting from hers not by imitation but by pace. She wrote like she was folding cloth, each line had weight. When I was 10, she let me address the envelopes for the electric company and the water bill. She said, "Ink is a promise in public." I didn't fully understand it then, but it felt important, like the cool edge of a coin in your palm. The first time I felt the house choose me, before I was old enough to call it legacy, was the winter the pipes burst. I stood beside Grandma in the cold kitchen while she talked to the plumber like she was negotiating tides. She thanked him 3 times in different ways, and when he was gone she taught me where the shut-off valve was and how to coax it without bruising your wrist. "Nobody respects the person who panics," she said. "Respect yourself enough to learn the boring things." That was love, the way she defined it, competence shared without spectacle. Mara never cultivated that kind of love. She loved the way fever loves, hot, immediate, indiscriminate, devouring whatever made her feel less alone. When we were teenagers and Grandma's garden went from random to careful, Mara borrowed the shears and cut roses into confetti for a boyfriend who left her anyway. Grandma didn't scold. She brought the cut stems inside, found a jar, and said, "They'll learn to drink again." Later, she showed me where she kept the pruning guide she'd made from index cards. "It's not magic," she said. "It's remembering what time asks of each thing." Memory felt easy then. It feels like labor now. When Mom started losing her edges, I began labeling drawers in pencil, spoons, towels, batteries, erasing and relabeling as if tidiness could build a fence around her mind. I wanted to believe I could keep the house speaking her language. Meanwhile, Mara was learning a different dialect, how to charm receptionists, how to perch on a hospital bed like a saint, how to translate concern into access. "Let me," she'd say, and it sounded like mercy. It also sounded like a key. In the hallway, my father's coat dripped discreetly onto the runner. He held a paper bag like a peace offering, a simple domestic trick, bring something that says you know how to be forgiven. The bag was probably from the grocery on Maple with the bell that tinkles like nostalgia. I had been a child who turned toward noise, I am a woman who uses it sparingly. He said, "I didn't mean to interrupt." The room laughed softly in the way rooms do when they're asked to confirm someone else's version of events. I replied, "You didn't." My voice slid out evenly, no rough edge for anyone to catch. I set the knife down on the table with care, aligning the handle with the seam in the runner. The movement steadied me. Grandma would have approved of putting things back where they belong before you try to fix anything larger. I remember a summer afternoon when I was 8 and the electricity stayed out all day. The house exhaled, quieter without the fridge hum. Grandma put the refrigerator contents into coolers like she'd planned it, then opened all the windows and set a bowl of water on the porch for the stray tabby who pretended she didn't need us. She taught me to shell peas while the radio hissed a little stream of headlines and weather. "What do we do when things go wrong?" she asked, a quiz without a wrong answer. I said, "We don't waste the time we're given complaining about the time we lost." She smiled, not showy, the way she smiled when bread came out of the oven golden all around. That was the year she showed me her ledger, a narrow, spiral-bound book with columns as clean as prayer. She wrote in the cost of flour, the new screen door, the $20 she loaned to Mr. Yoon's wife when their dryer conked out. She kept track of what came in, what went out, and what never should have moved. She called it the story only the house knows. When I grew older, she let me write in it. I practiced carefulness, the way some girls practice eyeliner. Now, with my father standing under Mom's chandelier like fate or a failed experiment, the ledger lines came back to me, what came in, what went out, what never should have moved. Mom's house lived on paper in a county office full of men in vests who smelled like last year's coffee, but it also lived in the way the stairs knew which of us was walking based on weight and patience. The stairs had pretended not to recognize him for many years. They were generous now, the way Oldwood forgives by remembering less. Mara's hand touched my elbow and then thought better of it. She drifted toward him like a queen toward a surprise ambassador. They hugged, brief and photogenic, each of them measuring the camera angles that didn't exist. My father thanked guests as if they were his, nodding toward faces that had never belonged to him. Someone handed him a paper plate. He took it like it was a trophy. He glanced at me and then away, the way people do when they're trying to make their own story true by not colliding with someone else's. I've learned that sometimes the best way to tell the truth is to prepare the dishwater and keep your hands submerged so you don't reach for the wrong thing too fast. Grandma used to say that inheritance is not a will, it's what you do with what you're left holding when there's no one to impress. She didn't mean money. She meant chores. She meant choosing not to repeat a pattern just because it fits like an old coat. After she died, I took the ledger, not because I wanted to be keeper of facts, but because paper was a promise in public and I didn't know how to promise loudly. I think of her hands in winter, the way skin thinned and showed the blue of everything underneath. She'd pour oil into the groove of her thumb and rub it into her knuckles without looking. Her rings clicked like tiny wind chimes. She never took them off except to knead dough. When I packed her room, I found a note in her sewing box, folded into a seam. "Make things easier for those who come after you," it said in her even letters. "Start with truth." Truth, at this birthday where my name was used like decoration, felt like a quilt with missing squares. I had brought with me 3 stitched pieces and the thread to start again. My father's presence shifted the colors. He was the kind of man who liked to sit close to the door, even inside he kept his shoes tied tight. He had left when I learned to drive, when I began to understand that the right turn signal still required checking the blind spot. He left a coffee mug with a cracked handle and a shoebox full of receipts like a breadcrumb trail to nowhere. He left the kind of absence that doesn't echo because it accepts the new furniture without argument. I looked at him now and saw a certain tiredness around the mouth, the kind you get from defending yourself to an empty room. He carried that paper bag like an alibi. He set it on the hall table, a small ceremony, and patted the top as if it might purr. The room shifted again, people making room for their curiosity. The cake candles kept burning down. Wax made small lakes on frosting. Mara had once taken a locket from Grandma's jewelry box and worn it to school. She said it made her feel like a story. When Grandma noticed it missing, she didn't ask Mara. She came to me while I was doing algebra and said, "It's not about the locket." I nodded, even though it was. She said, "If you choose to be keeper of things, people will use you like a shelf. Decide early what weight your wood can take." I didn't even know I had wood. That day, I put the locket back without saying a word to my sister. Mara returned home flushed with the attention she thought she deserved. She never asked how the universe had conspired to keep her from trouble. She assumed she was forgiven because she preferred a world that did that. What I could not accept now was a world that made my mother's signature a costume anyone could wear, or turned my grandmother's ledger into confetti. The envelope against my rib had become a metronome. I kept time with it. My father's eyes grazed me like a moth too tired to commit to the light. He said, "You look good, kiddo." I replied, "You're late." It wasn't a weapon, just a measurement. He blinked. Time rearranged itself in the room, a subtle click like a camera shutter. I could feel people evaluating the temperature between us as if they could warm their hands on it or warn themselves away. He looked past me at Mom. His face did a complicated thing I didn't want to analyze yet. I remembered the summer he built the fence and left the last post uncemented, a loose thing wobbling in the wind, because he had to take a call. I told Grandma it bothered me to see it half done. She put her hand on my shoulder, a steadying pressure. "Some people live like that post," she said. "They'll tell you it's temporary until it's part of the yard. You decide if you're going to learn to walk around it or if you're going to set it right." I learned to pour quickset concrete without telling anyone. I set it right at dawn and went to school with sand in my hair. My father noticed that evening and said something about initiative, as if he'd built me that way. I didn't correct him. I learned early that fixing things quietly gives you time to decide if you want the credit or the control. I always took the control. Now control meant letting the room keep murmuring while I walked to the sideboard and poured Mom a glass of water. I lifted her hand to wrap her fingers around it. She lifted the glass with concentration and drank. Her throat moved, delicate, defiant. I smoothed the cardigan again. Mara was talking near the door, high and bright. My father nodded, hands in his pockets, his shoulders arranging themselves into a familiar outline of ease. He pronounced apologies with the deftness of a man who once believed in the absolution of mourning. I watched their mouths move and felt the old triangular geometry try to reassert itself, him at the top, us at the base, all load-bearing beams pointed upward. I stayed still and didn't allow the house to return to a shape it had outgrown. Grandma kept a jar of coins on the laundry room shelf labeled surprises. She broke into it when the dryer ate socks in pairs or when the gutters refused a season. "Not all surprises are parties," she'd say, so gently it wasn't a correction. Budget for both kinds. When she died, the jar was half full. I took it to the bank and let the machine count the metal into numbers. It felt like translating a poem and losing something. I kept the jar empty on my shelf to remind me that preparation is a form of love that doesn't get applause. I can't say I expected this exact configuration, the candles guttering toward decision, the envelope like a heartbeat, my father in a too warm coat and Mara in a peach dress that didn't belong to her, but all the lines led here. The house had been narrating this for months under the noise of the television and the rinse cycle and the small wars of a family that prefers performance to stewardship. The ledger had its own sentence construction, and I had finally learned to read it without asking anyone else out loud. I lifted one hand and pinched the nearest candle wick between damp fingers. The flame died with a tiny squeal, a small mercy. People laughed, relieved to be allowed back into a world with tidy edges. I extinguished the rest, calm and methodical. Smoke curled up like the script of a language I could articulate by touch. I set the candles aside. I looked at Mara. I looked at my father. I looked at Mom. My grandmother's voice wasn't a voice, it was the cool weight of the ring I wore out of habit, the careful click of carefulness. I could feel the spine of part 2 of the story press against my palm, the one the house wrote when it chose someone to know where the shut-off valve lived, the one where love is the sum of unremarkable actions performed without announcement. My father took one small step forward, shoes whispering to wood, and in that breath's width of movement I realized he hadn't come to watch. He had brought his own version of paper. The hallway light caught on a corner of something manila protruding from the grocery bag, the neat edge of an envelope that didn't look like bread or kindness. I didn't reach for it. I let the knowledge settle the way you let a jar of cloudy water clear on its own, heavier truths drifting below where they can't be stirred up by the first spare breath. Outside, the rain found a new rhythm against the porch roof, a soft percussion that sounded almost like counting. I counted with it and felt myself steady as if my feet were finding clearer ground. And then I heard the unmistakable quick tap of Mara's heels pivoting behind me, toward the dining room, toward the drawer where Grandma's ledger used to live. Pressure has a scent when it ripens, sugar burning at the edges, lemon turning sharp. I moved before anyone noticed I'd moved, a small step sideways that put my body between Mara and the dining room doorway. She brushed past with a smile that didn't belong to me, and I let her shoulder skim mine the way a blade recognizes another blade. The room's murmur lifted as if someone tilted it. The little drawer in the sideboard had always stuck. You had to pull, pause, then pull again with a small twist. She forgot the pause, yanked too hard, and the jerk rattled the cutlery like metal teeth. I stayed where I was. My father's paper bag sat on the hall table, the manila corner showing like a flag. He pretended not to watch Mara. Mara pretended not to need watching. Guests did what guests do when they sense a drama they can't name. They fetched napkins, touched their hair, performed concern as a social grace. The house tolerated it, wood and drywall holding its breath. Grandma would have called this a test of balance. She meant the point where you choose who you are without telling anybody. I didn't say a word. I went to the sink and ran water, rinsed the knife clean, set it in the rack. The motion steadied the fever in the room. When I turned back, Mara had the drawer open only halfway. Her painted nail tapped on wood, impatient. She said, "Do you mind?" I replied, "No." I stepped beside her and placed my fingers under the drawer's lip, felt the catch, waited for the tremor, then coaxed. It slid. She was too quick, hand darting for the ledger that wasn't there anymore because it hadn't lived there in months. The space held an ordinary collection of non-answers, birthday candles, the emergency list Grandma wrote in pencil, an old church program with someone's careful algebra on the back. Mara's smile paused, rewrote itself, carried on. She lifted the emergency list and held it to the light like proof of something. I watched her eyes scan the neat columns of names and numbers. The doctor's name, the plumber's, the neighbor's, mine. She let it fall back into the drawer with a breath that wasn't a sigh because sighs admit loss. Her hand found a thinner notebook underneath, one of the spiral pads Grandma used for grocery totals. She flipped to the middle with too much flourish. "Look," she said to the room, but she was looking at me. Grandma kept track of everything. The pad contained recipes, a list of bulbs to plant, the note where Grandma reminded herself to call Mrs. Yoon about the new zipper. Nothing that could be made into a stage. Mara closed it and put it on top as if she'd discovered treasure and was saving it for later. Her heels clicked her back into the living room with a brightness that felt like glass underfoot. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from a number I didn't recognize pulsed on the screen with a thumbnail from the county recorder's site, the parcel number for Mom's house, today's date stamped at the top. Underneath, a note, flagged activity, call me. The name attached was one I knew faintly, a clerk I'd once spoken to about deed copies who had appreciated that I said please. I glanced up, Mara's mouth moving like a well-oiled machine, my father nodding in slow rhythm. My thumb hovered over the call button and then didn't. Not yet. I needed more than the alarm, I needed the pattern. Pressure works better in a crowd. Mara knows that. She held the room the way a seamstress holds fabric, pinch here, smooth there, a tuck that hides, a pleat that flatters. She told a story about birthday wishes becoming plans, about daughters stepping up, about community making things simple. The words simple and handled have done more quiet harm in our house than any loud sin. People nodded, grateful to be told how to feel. My father slipped the manila envelope free and palmed it like a friendly trick. He waited for a seam in Mara's monologue and loosened the flap. I saw the corner of a form printed on the kind of paper that tries to look official without earning it. He glanced at me once and then away, the way old dogs avoid the one person who knows their tricks. The cake sat uncut, smoking faintly from the extinguished wicks. Mom watched the room like someone pretending to follow a foreign film without subtitles. Her hand patted her lap for a rhythm that wouldn't settle. I leaned close and she took my fingers, the way she used to take a lane in a crowded grocery and trust me to steer. Across the room, I saw Nina near the window, quiet, observant, a coworker who'd come because office culture makes attendance a synonym for loyalty. Her gaze was not the hungry kind. She was the only person other than me in the house who looked like she was measuring instead of reacting. She held a paper plate she wasn't eating from and her phone lay face down on the sill within easy reach. We caught each other's eyes briefly and then returned them to the crowd. That was enough, a faint thread tugged between us. The pressure began to organize itself. A cousin with a good haircut told a story about how tricky this stuff is, meaning aging parents, meaning signatures, meaning who deserves to be in charge. Someone added that Elena has always been the responsible one, as if it were flattering to be volunteered into servitude. Mara tilted her head in a way that made people want to clap. My father made a modest mouth, regretful, appreciative, matter-of-fact. The manila envelope breathed. My phone buzzed again. Another notification I had set up for myself weeks ago when patterns first began to misbehave. Transaction alert, $8,000 transfer pending from savings. The bank app bleated like a lamb at the edge of a field. The timestamp was 2 minutes old. The destination was a name I recognized too well to pretend it didn't matter. I inhaled and felt the inhale scrape. I didn't look at Mara. I didn't look at my father. I looked at the faucet and turned it off because I couldn't stand the idea that something in this house might be wasted because I was busy being polite. The silence the faucet left behind made room for the room to sound like what it was, a performance of benevolence with a cash register humming backstage. He said, "We brought paperwork to ease the burden." The sentence landed like a wet towel across the shoulders of the crowd. People leaned forward. Ease. Burden. Paperwork. The words did what they were designed to do, sanctify an agenda. I felt Nina's attention sharpen, no movement, but something in the air around her gathered its weight. I replied, "We're not doing that here." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The sentence sat in the doorway and refused to move. Mara laughed in a tone she uses for waiters when the check is taking too long. She lifted her hands in a hostess gesture that said, "This is normal, everyone relax, she's kidding, it's all fine." My father adjusted his grip on the envelope, like a man reconsidering the size of a door he wants to push through. The gaslighting began with the gentlest flame. Mara crossed to Mom and smoothed her hair and said how much she loved how strong I was, how I always took care of things, how we were in this together, how she just wanted to make it easier on me because I worked so hard. Each phrase was a small rope thrown over a larger beam. Together they could hoist something heavy and ugly up high and call it a decoration. My body remembered the years of being told I was so good with details as a way of handing me the entire labor. It remembered being called practical when I said no to whatever made someone else feel briefly adored. It remembered Mara crying in bathrooms while I wiped eyeliner off her cheeks with toilet paper because grocery store tissues were too soft to do real work. It remembered my father promising to fix the uncemented post and then finding a reason to tell a joke instead. I let their words fall where they landed. Then I did the only thing that mattered, I checked on Mom. I crouched so we were level. Her breath smelled like peppermint. Her pulse under my fingertips was steady, small. I waited for her to look at me and when she did there was a window. I stepped through it. I said, "Do you need anything?" She blinked, trying to translate the question into a weight her hands knew how to hold. She lifted the water and drank with the concentration of a person pouring two liquids together without spilling either. She nodded once. It wasn't yes. It was I'm here. The difference matters more than people who don't live in rooms like this will ever understand. Nina was suddenly at my shoulder without intrusion, the way a second hand passes the hour hand and then the moment is gone but time has changed. She didn't touch me. She didn't smile. She set her untouched plate on the end table and looked at the manila envelope as if it were just another office memo. Then she looked at me. Her expression was a question without punctuation. She whispered so low it almost wasn't sound, "Do you want me to take pictures?" I nodded once. Motion so small it could be chalked up to breath. She stepped back and became another guest again, but her phone was in her hand now, screen face into her palm. Mara had found a small pedestal for the envelope to rest on, Grandma's brass tray that used to hold keys and now held theater. My father slid the documents free one by one and arranged them like an altar. The top page was a care plan with boxes checked by someone else's pen. Underneath, a listing agreement printed with the stark cleanliness of a fresh start. The third page wore the shape of an authority it didn't deserve, my mother's name at the top, a signature at the bottom that tried to be hers. The crowd didn't know where to look. People are kind. They want to believe what they're given. They also want to avoid seeing anything that will obligate them to stand up out of their chair. Mara counted on it the way a magician counts on the way eyes follow what shines. She framed her face with concern and spoke of stress and schedules and how honesty is love. She made my refusal sound like cruelty without using the word. My phone vibrated again in my other hand. A text from the clerk, "Call if you need me to hold record." There's a window. I swallowed the fact of being seen by someone outside this room and made a place for it inside me, a small shelf cleared for later. The gaslighting leveled up. Mara turned a story about my attention to detail into a narrative about my rigidity, my alleged inability to let others help. My father added a paragraph about being out of the loop and the importance of communication. He managed to imply that my strong personality sometimes alienated people who were only trying to support me. It was elegant, the way people who don't consider themselves liars are often the most persuasive carriers of untruths. They wrap falsehood in florals and hand it over like an apology casserole. I didn't break. I also didn't speak. I moved like water moves when it looks still, finding the place where it can reshape the shore without calling attention to itself. Nina had become a shadow with a lens. She didn't flash, didn't lift her device high, just let the surface of her phone drink the information and file it away in a quiet pocket. My boss, bless her precise heart, stepped forward and asked whether there had been sound counsel on these arrangements. The way she said counsel made the room lose 2 degrees. Mara thanked her like a hostess thanks someone for asking where the bathroom is. She rattled off a last name that did not belong to anyone I would let near the ledger if the ledger were here. My father referred to advice received from a friend who knows the field. No titles, no letters after names, just the soft fog of authority borrowed from the idea of authority itself. I said, "We're going to slow down." 3 words placed carefully on the table like a weight. They rolled through the room and then sank. Mara smiled so brightly it made my teeth ache. She pivoted to Mom, lowered herself like a saint into a kneel that hovered without creasing her dress. She said, "Mom, sweetheart, do you want us to take care of the hard parts? You trust us, right?" It was a cheat of a question, a tight box disguised as a blanket. Trust isn't a signature. It's a quiet hand on a shut-off valve at 3 a.m. Mom nodded because nodding is what you do when the room is waiting. A cousin sighed with relief they hadn't earned. I leaned closer to Mom and laid my hand on her arm. She turned to me. There was a flicker, just a match head, but sometimes a match is enough to light a room. She spoke very softly, the way noise leaves a body when it's learned to be polite. She said, "I want you to read it." It was barely sound, but it was public. The ledger of her voice placed a line across their page. I reached for the top document. My father's hand hovered the way a hand hovers when it wants to block without making a scene. I ignored it. I read. The care plan assigned decisions to authorized agent with a blank filled by my sister's name. The listing agreement was open-ended in ways that would make a broker sweat if they knew how to be honest. The signature page was dated today, time blank, witness lines empty. The signature itself was a ghost of my mother's real name, the M.A. wavering mountain, the rest a tired river. I held the page up and didn't accuse it out loud of being born wrong. I just let the room see it clearly. Nina moved 2 inches, enough to change her angle. My boss's mouth set into a shape that makes junior accountants straighten their spines. A neighbor who loves to be helpful offered a story about when her own father sold property quickly because it was better for everyone. She meant to help. She helped the way a wind helps a fire. My phone pulsed in my palm again, and this time it was the bank. Pending transfer approved. Approved. Past tense. The number sat there, a quiet, confident zero parade. Someone near the window laughed at a joke about candles. I registered the incongruity and set it down. I could pick it up later. Right now I needed to reduce oxygen without anyone fainting. I set the pages back on the brass tray with a neatness that made a point without giving it a name. I met my father's eyes. The years gathered around us like old furniture. He looked away first. Mara recovered with grace and offered cake as if sugar could laminate the moment. Plate slid into hands. People chewed compliance, grateful for something to do with their mouths. Nina's phone buzzed. She glanced once and then drifted near the hallway as if investigating whether there were extra forks. She returned, brushed by me, and let her voice be a temperature I could feel rather than a sound I had to grab. She whispered, "If you need a name, I have one. A name like a hinge." I nodded without looking. The room applauded cake like it was a newborn. My boss excused herself with an honest hug. My father leaned against the doorframe like a man who wants a cigarette more than a solution. Mara cut slices too generous to be kind, her movements crisp, efficient, liturgical. Gaslighting never arrives alone. It brings guilt as its date. A cousin pressed my hand and told me I was doing the right thing by letting people help. Another told me I couldn't do everything. A third mentioned how heroic I'd been and then offered to start a group chat to coordinate efforts that I didn't ask for. It was all lace around a trap. I thanked them because I was raised to. Then I went to the sink and washed 3 glasses with care, the cloth catching on a chip I'd known since I was 11. It steadied me better than any speech. In the reflection on the window I could see the living room as a blurred theater, Mara lifting her plate to the light, my father flipping the manila flap closed, Mom licking a finger to catch a bit of frosting with the concentration of a child. The house held. The ledger existed elsewhere, exactly where it needed to be. The envelope in my coat had not moved. My phone was a metronome counting a song no one else could hear. Pressure carries a secondary edge, isolation. The room had arranged itself so that I was both centerpiece and periphery, necessary and outnumbered. I have been trained by rooms like this not to ask for help because help arrives with conditions. I breathed and let myself want help anyway, but the kind that doesn't require applause. I looked at Nina and she was already looking at me. She shifted her weight, and in that small shift I felt something like a beam brace slip into place. My father scraped a fork over his plate and made the kind of announcement that pretends to be small. He said, "I can drop these by the notary on my way out." The sentence held an exit strategy and a threat in one palm. Mara nodded as if to music the rest of us couldn't hear. Mom blinked at the way the fork made a comet trail through frosting. I dried my hands and laid the towel flat. I didn't look at the envelope in my coat. I didn't have to. It existed like a lighthouse exists even when fog pretends it doesn't. I said, "They won't be traveling tonight." My father's mouth twitched. Mara laughed again with her nice waitress laugh. A guest asked if the coffee machine worked and I said it did. I made a pot because hospitality is a language I speak fluently even when the conversation is hostile. The smell shifted the room's center of gravity by 2 degrees. Nina angled near the doorway, pressed her phone into my palm for precisely 1 second, enough for me to see what she'd pulled up, a website for an elder law attorney 3 neighborhoods over, a woman with gray hair and eyes that looked like they understood what ledger meant in houses like ours. Nina had already typed "tomorrow 9:15" in a text window addressed to a number labeled direct. She hadn't hit send. She looked at me. I nodded. She hit send and then walked away as if she'd gone to check on cream. The rain on the porch roof found a new tempo and I counted with it until my heart gave up and matched. Mara lifted her glass for a toast that didn't use the word toast. People lifted theirs because wrists respond to cues faster than minds. I sipped water and remembered the jar labeled surprises. I remembered baskets of laundry and the way Grandma didn't fold resentment into any of it, just aligned fabric with sober kindness and moved to the next thing. The bank notification sat silent now, its bell rung. The clerk's text lived on the lock screen like a doorstop. The tray with its papers tried to look inevitable. My coat with its envelope hung obedient on the back of a chair like a sentry that doesn't need to be seen to serve. The house creaked once, like a knee reminding you it's been patient. When the plates were mostly empty and the compliments had finished their polite orbit, my father scooped the manila papers together like a man tucking a trick back into a deck. He moved toward the hallway with the absent-mindedness of intent. Mara gathered her dress, her face a flawless mask of someone who trusts the script. Guests collected purses and kindnesses. Mom yawned without hiding it, a small rebellion. I followed him to the hall. My footsteps made the quiet sound of someone walking on a familiar floor, not the declarative sound of a duel. He turned slightly, enough to catch me in peripheral. He said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I replied, "I won't." The words were true. I wasn't going to make it harder. I was going to make it correct. He paused, not quite sure where his authority had gone. Nina's message buzzed my phone again, one vibration that meant something had answered. I didn't look. The who and the time could exist for a few minutes without me. I needed the room to empty without a scene that could be narrated against me later. I have learned that the first person to raise her voice buys the reputation. We moved as if each of us believed the other would blink first. He put the envelope under his arm like a newspaper. I crossed to my coat and slipped the weight of my own envelope deeper into the inner pocket. I tasted lemon cleaner and old wood. I let the room refill with small sounds, chairs scooting, zippers, the weather clearing its throat on the other side of the front door. In the doorway, my father adjusted his scarf. Mara kissed air near cheeks. People said it had been lovely. It had not. It had been instructive. At the threshold he hesitated, then reached into the paper bag. He pulled out not wine, not bread, but a small square box with a ribbon. He set it on the hall table under the mirror with the gravity of a man leaving a relic. The ribbon was the color of apology. He didn't look at me when he placed it. He looked at his hands, which is a kind of prayer in some cultures. The last pair of heels tapped down the porch steps. The door closed with a hush that made the house feel private again. The quiet swelled, not empty, just returned to the size it knows itself to be. I took the gift box to the dining room and set it on the brass tray beside the papers that had tried to become scripture. The ribbon untied itself easily, like it was relieved to stop pretending to hold anything together. Inside was a key on a velvet bed, an old one, brass, its teeth worn smooth, Grandma's key to the shed. Attached by a cheap ring was a smaller new key with a stickered, a storage unit number in my father's square handwriting. Another note underneath, for safekeeping. I had the sudden sense of a door I hadn't known existed press against the back of my ribs, waiting to be opened from the other side. The house exhaled. The rain lightened. Somewhere, very close, a clock I hadn't heard all evening remembered itself and began to tick. Strategy tastes like metal on the tongue. It steadies you and reminds you what you're holding. The clock's small ticking stitched the house back together 1 second at a time. I repacked what didn't belong on the brass tray, the papers that tried to pass as inevitable, and returned them to their manila skin. I didn't hide them. I put them on the sideboard where the light from the lamp was clean and unforgiving, and I took 3 photos in silence, overview, details, signature line. The camera clicked like a modest gavel. Nina's link sat on my phone like a lit window, below it, the clerk's message waited like a hand on a brake. I washed the cake knife until it squeaked against my thumb, dried it, slid it into the drawer that sticks, found the catch by feel, closed it without pronouncing anything final. Mom's yawn had softened the room into something that didn't require performance. I helped her to bed the way you carry a bowl of water, steady, close, without watching yourself. She let me unbutton the cardigan all the way and laughed once, a small, surprised bell, when the sleeve got stuck. I tucked the blanket to the shape of her shoulders and sat on the edge of the mattress until her breathing found the slow lane. On the dresser, the framed photo of Grandma's hands kneading bread was a horizon line. It made the room honest. Downstairs, I opened my coat to check the envelope, pressing at my ribs the way you check a pulse, confirmation, not fear. It had not moved. I placed it flat on the dining table and laid a palm on it, the way Grandma used to test dough for readiness, waiting for the barely perceptible give. Ready wasn't a feeling, it was an alignment. The storage keys lay in their velvet like two versions of the same sentence, the old brass, worn smooth by a life that didn't need to be watched, the new nickel, bright and eager to be named. I didn't trust gifts that arrived without context, but I also didn't ignore tools when work had to be done. I slid both keys into my pocket and felt the shift in my center of gravity. My phone vibrated once, a long, low sound that could be answered or not and would keep existing either way. I chose. I stepped into the laundry room, shut the door softly, and called the number the clerk had sent. When he answered, I kept my voice level and my information neat. I spelled Mom's name, gave the parcel number, the year the house was paid off. I didn't accuse. I asked what I was allowed to ask, where the pause button lived. He said, "We can place a courtesy hold if there's a reasonable question about authority." I replied, "There is." He didn't ask me to perform it. He asked for a fax number I don't own because it's not 1997. When I paused, he supplied an email instead, careful, almost apologetic, like a man who's learned that bureaucracy can be kind if you whisper to it. He said the word window and I wrote it down on the back of a grocery list, 72 hours. Not forever. Enough to work with. I sent what I had, scans of the 3 pages in my coat, the metadata sitting polite at the bottom of each image, the timestamp on the listing agreement that thought it was a birth certificate but wasn't. I attached a short note with the truth's spine but not its teeth, temporary hold requested pending council review. I signed my name the way Grandma taught me, like folding cloth. He wrote back with a single sentence that mattered more than anything anyone had said all night: received, hold placed, confirmation attached. Paper talking to paper in a language I speak. Next, the bank. The call tree made me prove I wasn't a robot and then made me hold while a sales pitch tried to sell me savings I'd already attempted. I turned the faucet off with my shoulder and listened to the steady nothing of a line that hadn't decided whether to be useful. When a human voice came on, it was tired and practiced, and I could feel the script in it like a rail under a foot. I gave Mom's name. I gave the account number I know because numbers are my version of family stories. I gave the amount and the time and the destination. I used the word exploitation once and then replaced it with concern. He said, "Are you on the account?" I replied, "I have fiduciary paperwork. There is a question regarding its validity. We're in council tomorrow morning. I need a temporary freeze on outgoing transfers pending review." The silence on his side was a calculation, not moral, procedural. Then, a new voice took over, warmer but firmer, a supervisor stepping into a doorway. I repeated less this time and more precisely. I didn't try to outrun the law with adjectives. I asked for their elder protection team. The supervisor moved me to a queue that didn't have music. The woman who answered sounded like she could fold a fitted sheet with one hand. I told her the facts and let them be the facts. She asked me questions I was grateful to have ready answers for: dates, doctors, a copy of a note from last month where Mom's neurologist wrote the words executive function and monitor. She requested a fax, I requested an email. She made one happen like someone who had already set 6 things right before lunch. She said she could place a temporary hold for 48 hours on any transfer not already cleared, and a flag requiring manual approval for the week beyond. She didn't promise what she couldn't. She told me what she could do. I said, "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude for the freeze, it was for the cadence of someone who understands the ledger of harm and fix in ordinary households. When I hung up, the house felt a degree safer, not safe, but on the road toward it. I texted Nina, 9:15 confirmed? Her reply was a dot, then a sentence, she'll see you even if she's on fire. I almost smiled. It wasn't that the attorney's name made me feel rescued. It was that the fact of someone specific was now tethered to mourning. Mourning is a kind of mercy if you've prepared for it. I made coffee, drank half, poured the rest into a jar for later. I wrote a list on the back of Grandma's emergency numbers, adding a column for proofs, the video on my phone of Mara's coaxing voice framed as kindness, the older documents in the fireproof box under my bed, the notarized letter from 2 years ago where Mom had written, in words that were still fully hers, that Elena knows the boring things, the ledger index card that pointed to key dates, the bank statements, the appointment card with the neurologist's handwriting, the text from the clerk, the email confirmations, the photos Nina had taken like a shadow. I wrote the storage unit number and the street where the facility lived behind a car wash and a thrift store where we bought picture frames when we were still buying picture frames. The old brass key told quietly in my pocket. I listened to what it asked. The shed doesn't need to be opened at midnight, my practical brain offered. My other brain, the one Grandma trained to read house weather, argued for now. The storage could wait for daylight and witnesses. The shed belonged to the old key, to a woman whose ledger was a compass. I took a flashlight and walked out into a yard that smelled like wet dirt, remembering summer. The padlock on the shed had part of a spiderweb tracing its face, a delicate language I brushed aside with an apology in my throat. The brass key slid in without fanfare and the lock gave with the resignation of something that knows when it's time. The door swung the way it always had, resistant for an inch, then free. The smell inside was glue and dust and the sweetness of dry wood. I stood until the air settled, then clicked on the light that may or may not work. It worked. Grandma's order lived even here. Boxes labeled by season and function, twine, seeds, paint, lights, stacked against the back wall. The workbench held 3 jars of screws sorted by size, lids dented into their own hierarchy. Hanging on nails were tools that carried the shine of respectful use, not abuse, the handsaw whose whine had always been a lullaby, the blue-handled pliers with a nick on one ear. On the shelf above the bench sat a metal cash box that had nothing to do with cash. It had been green once, dulled to a color you wouldn't be tempted to trust. It wasn't locked. Inside waited an index card with my name in Grandma's hand and 4 objects that weighed more than their matter. The original receipt from the title company the year the house was freed, a list of account names written with the brevity of someone who understands that letters can outlast people, a thin, square photograph of Grandma standing beside the just-painted front steps with blue on her knuckles, and a sturdier envelope sealed with the tidy cross of Scotch tape she favored. The envelope had a date in the corner, 2 springs ago. Not an occasion, just a moment between grocery runs and radiators, chosen with deliberation. I slid the blade of my thumbnail under the tape and unzipped it along the fold like a seam. Inside lay a durable power of attorney dutifully signed and notarized on the dining table, 2 witnesses listed, Mrs. Yoon and her husband, and my name where agent wanted to be. I ran my finger over the notary seal, that small embossed sun with its official geography, and felt the relief I hadn't allowed myself make a quiet room inside my ribs. There was also a shorter letter, just 3 lines, in Grandma's voice even though it was Mom's hand. If I forget the boring things, Elena knows. If I say yes because someone says please, Elena knows what my real yes was. Start with truth. The ink looked confident, the date sat beside it like a sensible friend. I took 5 photos and then tucked the documents back into the envelope and slid it into the inner pocket of my coat with its siblings. On the way out, I turned off the light and stood in the door a moment longer than necessary, letting the smell of dry wood and mineral dust lay a film over my skin the way heritage can if you don't scrub it off in a panic. Back inside, the house accepted me, the floor keeping the secret that my heartbeat had sped up. I filed the new proofs into my list, attached the images to an email for Nina labeled with plain language and no drama, and typed one more to the clerk thanking him without pleading. Paper remembers tone, even electronically. The box from my father sat emptily on the hall table, the ribbon now a flat line, the velvet bed showing the negative shape of the keys the way absence sometimes proves intent better than presence. I kept thinking about the double key and the way he had set it down without looking at me. He had not brought bread or wine, he had brought access. Whether it was meant to help or to count me, I couldn't yet know. But either way, access has to be used if it is to be translated into proof. I set an alarm for 7:10, then added a second for 5 minutes later because mornings can steal intention. I put the kettle on and poured hot water over 2 tea bags and a thermos because you never leave a meeting thirsty. I printed a copy of the appointment confirmation that Nina had forwarded, the elder law attorney's name at the top like a door with a handle you can see. I printed the bank email, the recorder's confirmation, and a 1-page timeline that could make a stranger understand 10 months in 3 minutes without making the story thinner than it deserved. Upstairs, Mom slept with the blanket rumpled in the exact way that always made Grandma tut and then laugh. I tucked the corner once and let the rumple be. It belonged to the person the blanket was warming, not to my desire for symmetry. On the nightstand, the old wind-up clock my grandfather used to fix by lightly striking the back with his knuckle ticked like a metronome, reminding us both that seconds are fair even when people aren't. I sat in the corridor outside her room for a while, back against the cool plaster, legs stretched out, letting the house borrow my weight. The quiet strategy wasn't a plan, it was a posture. It meant choosing paper over performance. It meant knowing who to call and when not to. It meant collecting yes that could outlast a room full of polite nodding and a tray full of almost documents. It meant kindness as tensile strength, not decoration. I thought of the ledger and the way Grandma had annotated the margin when something mattered more than arithmetic, a dot next to a date, a check next to a name. I drew a dot in my head next to the morning's 9:15 and another next to the clerk's hold and a third next to the bank's freeze. Dots are not a victory. They are the bones of one. The wind bumped the eaves and then apologized. In the half-dark, I could feel the house listening the way living things do when their people make decisions. The day would come with its weather. I needed sleep that was more like storage than like escape. I set my phone face down and leaned my head against the wall until my neck stopped holding itself like a question. When the alarm sang, it wasn't cruel. It was doing its job. I showered with the quickness of someone who doesn't want to use up the day's courage on hot water, put on a blouse with sleeves that fit under a coat, chose flats that didn't announce themselves, and tied my hair in a way that said I have time even when I didn't. I left a note for Mom on the kitchen table under the salt, where she always looks first, back by noon. Nina will call if you need anything. Eat the yogurt. Love, E. The sky had not committed to sun or rain. It hovered. I took both keys and the folder I'd organized at the dining table into the clean, compact geometry that offices respect. I laid the manila envelope on top of my own, like a story trying to ride the tail of a better one, and I slipped it into my bag because you don't pretend the other story doesn't exist, you anchor it to the table where it has to answer questions. The storage unit address glowed bluntly on my phone, industrial, an easy left after the car wash, a row of doors painted a shade of blue that always seems temporary. The lawyer's office was across town, an old house converted to competence, mullioned windows holding diplomas instead of plants. I could do both if I didn't pretend to be heroic. The storage first, with a camera and a witness, then counsel, with paper and calm. I texted Nina, quick stop before, storage. Witness? Her dots appeared like footsteps. Already in the car. I locked the house, checked the handle, then checked it again because I believed doors should know you meant it. The street was the kind that holds last night's rain in its seams, quiet, obedient. I slid behind the wheel and the city unrolled in front of me with the reluctant grace of a place that knows you've lived there long enough to stop saying the names of streets out loud. At the red light by the thrift store I could see the row of units lined up like classroom cubbies for grown-ups, each storing a version of "we'll get to it." The nickel key in my pocket vibrated the way small metals do when their turn is near. I pulled in, found the number from the sticker, and parked with the nose toward the exit, not because I planned to flee, but because directions matter. Nina's car slid in beside mine without ceremony. She stepped out wearing the look of someone who knows she doesn't need to be thanked now. She'll be thanked when we're both too tired to pretend it was easy. She raised her eyebrows once. Ready? And I nodded. The door to the unit faced east, the sky behind it learning how to be morning. I fitted the new key into the lock. It caught for a fraction in the way of things that have not yet decided to let you in. I turned my wrist, felt the tumbler accept the pressure, and the latch gave with a flat, clean click that felt less like permission and more like responsibility wearing its simplest coat. Then, as the door rolled up and the strip of interior light peeled across cardboard and metal and a familiar, careful handwriting on a label, I felt the day tilt toward whatever would require the most truth from me. Power changes temperature before it changes shape. I felt the air cool as the door rose. The unit breathed paper and metal, cardboard ink, the faint iron of a shelving unit, dust like a soft coat over lives reduced to labels. Each box was written in the same careful script: taxes, appliance manuals, photos, church, receipts, house. A row along the back wall held 4 bankers' boxes with brighter tape, newer handwriting. They didn't belong to my grandmother's rhythm. I slid one forward, the tape resisting, then giving. Inside, a ledger I'd never seen, narrow columns in blue, not Grandma's green, entries from the last 8 months written by a hand that loved speed more than accuracy. It listed care expenses in round numbers too confident to be true, a bouquet of cash withdrawals, and a side note with my sister's initials in a loop I recognized even without wanting to. A thin envelope lay beneath with a familiar notary stamp and a date that had learned how to lie. I let the page rest under my palm so the impulse to scorch it could turn into something legal. Nina stood at my shoulder, silent, an extra set of eyes trained to sort signal from static. She tugged her sleeve back and lifted a phone not to record a scandal but to preserve the pattern, overviews, close-ups, file names that would matter later. The second bright taped box held a zippered pouch with a cheap lock and a key paper clipped to the side. Inside were 3 USB drives labeled as if they were homework: receipts, contacts, video. I didn't plug them in. I logged them, photographed them, moved them to the left, made space for caution to go first. The third bright taped box was different. It held an old tin with a postcard taped to the lid in Grandma's script: "If funny business starts, open this." The humor made my mouth sting. I pried the tin open. It offered up a copy of the durable power of attorney we'd found in the shed, another letter in Mom's clear hand with dates that made arithmetic sense, and a short paragraph in Grandma's blocky capitals: "Elena knows the boring things, leave her be." It was not a legal document, but it was a compass, and sometimes that's the more powerful instrument. Under the tin, folded into a file jacket like a delicate map, lay appraisals and an insurance schedule I didn't know existed. It listed the house, the contents Grandma considered worth naming, and one line item that didn't fit: a storage unit declared as containing household papers, recorded media, and backup of ledgers. I understood what my father had given me with that tiny nickel key. It was not a favor. It was access to a room where truth could be stored until someone remembered how to use it. We didn't take anything without logging it. Nina read dates aloud, soft as a metronome. I assembled a packet for the meeting, copies of what mattered most, leaving originals in the unit with a fresh lock Nina had produced from her bag without comment. The door rattled down, the new lock clicked, the key slid into the inside pocket with its older cousin. The sky had chosen a high, indifferent gray that makes cities honest. We drove across town without the radio on. The converted house that held the attorney's office wore its competence without apology: fresh paint without ostentation, a brass plate with a name that didn't ask for admiration, a doormat that said simply, "Hello." Nina squeezed my shoulder once before the door opened from within. The woman who greeted us looked like someone who had retired from being disappointed by people and now preferred to rearrange their outcomes. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered a conference room and a carafe of water and a legal pad with a pen that wrote the first time. We set the packet on the table, in the order my list prescribed. The room's windows held pale morning without glare. She flipped through each page with a tempo I recognized. She read like someone who repairs machines: parts, fit, friction, function. She said, "We'll start by making the window a wall." I replied, "Tell me where to push." She called the clerk on a line that didn't make us hold. She sent a letter with the kind of letterhead that makes people sit up straighter. She asked to speak to the bank's elder protection supervisor and didn't bother with the preamble. She spoke in a dialect made of statues and case numbers that turns policy into action. When she hung up, she turned to me with a small nod, nothing dramatic, all movement. "We'll need them in the room," she said, meaning my sister, meaning my father. "Invite them," I said. She didn't ask if I was sure. She dialed. Words were civil, precise. She knew how to bait a hook without bleeding. Mara arrived 40 minutes later, exactly on time because lateness is a power play you can only afford when you're right. My father came 5 minutes after, coat open like he expected this to be a short errand. The attorney had coffee waiting that smelled like someone cared that we were alive, not just that we had arrived. Mara walked in with apology-lit eyes, the kind of smile she uses when she wants to appear in charge of graciousness. She sat as if she'd been told where. My father took the chair that faces the door. He never forgets an exit. The attorney didn't waste the room on preface. She put the durable power of attorney on the table between all of us and used the kind of voice that respects the weight of paper. She said, "This governs." Mara glanced at the notary seal as if recognizing a rival. My father's jaw made a small pivot he thought went unnoticed. The attorney laid the second letter beside it, the 3 lines where Mom had written what a yes meant when a room got loud. She continued, "This clarifies intent." Mara attempted benevolence. She said that everyone is trying their best, that communication got crossed, that she only ever wanted to lighten the load. She reached for a page from her manila and slid it forward like an olive branch. The attorney did not take it. She asked who drafted it. She asked when. She asked under whose supervision. She asked if the witnesses were in the room now. She didn't write any of the answers down. That was its own verdict. My father tested a different angle, the one where he appears practical. He said he'd brought an option, a temporary solution, that he could drop things by the notary on his way if it saved us trouble. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms down, as if he'd stopped a map from curling. The attorney lifted one eyebrow a distance that would not be called dramatic in any text. She took out the bank's confirmation, the recorder's hold, the clerk's simple sentence received, hold placed, and set them in an array that made a sequence. She looked at me then, not for permission, but to include me in the control. She said, "My client will be revoking any instruments executed without authority and will be recording notice of that revocation today. She will also be instituting an accounting." Mara's smile flickered at the edge, a candle pushed by a door opening. She campaigned for the room's sympathy with a well-practiced pivot toward a narrative about how this kind of rigidity can alienate family. She said she wished we could do this without being so legal about it. The attorney let the air absorb that and then didn't respond. She slid across a page titled in a way that would make anyone's molars pay attention, Agreement to Refrain and Return. She said, "Sign here to refrain from entering into any contracts, listings, or transfers related to Ms. Alvarez's property without my client's written consent, and to return the $8,000 in question within 24 hours. Or don't. In which case we will file for emergency relief and a protective order by close of business." She didn't raise her voice. It didn't need to be raised, it had scaffolding. Mara looked at my father the way daughters look at men who once promised to fix wobbly posts. He looked back at her as if he were deciding who would write his next alibi. He said something about misunderstandings and unfortunate timing. Nina sat very still. My hands didn't shake. He said, "Let's not escalate." I replied, "Then don't." The attorney pushed 2 pens into the light between them and the page. "Silence is a good negotiator when you give it space." Mara broke first. She picked up a pen the way a soprano takes in breath before a note she doesn't believe in, and she signed. My father made a show of reading and then signed without drama because drama has a cost and he understands budgets. The attorney countersigned as witness and slid copies to their side of the table with a charity that wasn't performance, it was procedure. She took out another sheet, a revocation notice drafted in clean, legal bone. She had me sign it. Her notary stamped the small sun into the corner without ceremony. Paper gained weight while we were all sitting there. It's a merciful physics. Mara tried one last maneuver, a small one, meant for future narration. She poured sugar into her tone and noble intent into her back. She said she was glad we could reach an understanding, that of course the listing was premature, that she would never go against Mom's wishes. Government gray on the page made her adjectives irrelevant. My father moved to stand as if that made the room over. The attorney wasn't done. She slid a copy of the ledger entries from the unit across the table and tapped the row where numbers pretended to be medicine. She didn't accuse. She asked for the receipts those entries claimed to be. Mara's lips shaped a story that didn't find words. My father looked at the ceiling. The attorney wrote one line on her pad, accounting due in 7 days. She circled it once. Mara looked at me then, not as a performance, not as a sister, but as a person facing a door that won't open unless the person on the other side deems it safe. Her eyes were wet in a way that used to undo me. It didn't now. I remembered the jar of coins labeled surprises and understood that sometimes the surprise is that you cannot be made to question the floor you're standing on anymore. She said, "Are you really doing this?" I replied, "I'm doing the boring thing." The attorney smiled at that without letting it reach her eyes. She stood, which turned the meeting into history. We all did the choreography of ending, chairs set back under the table, papers squared, pens capped. Mara collected her bag like a woman preparing to take credit for a party that had concluded without incident. My father reached for the door, I reached first and opened it. In the hallway, a man waited with a small stack of papers and a badge clipped to his belt that wasn't designed to impress, only to identify. He didn't have to raise his voice to make the law present. He confirmed names, spoke politely, handed my sister an envelope, then my father. The word summons sat there without decoration. Their faces made room for the understanding that there was now a date they couldn't control on a calendar they didn't own. And then my phone vibrated, a single pulse that carried more weight than the last hour. It was the clerk. The message was clean, attempted e-recording 9:03 a.m. by Notary M, blocked by hold. Same party just arrived in person at counter with alternate document. The attorney read it over my shoulder without invading my space. She didn't sigh. She nodded once and picked up the line that leads to a judge's chambers the way some people pick up milk on the way home. Nina's hand hovered near my elbow like a promise. The conference room door clicked shut behind us, and the building felt like a lung holding air for the beat before an exhale. I turned toward the window, felt the glass cool under my fingertips, and watched the morning sharpen as if the city had just remembered what time it was. The law moved like a tide, quiet at first, then undeniable. Our attorney spoke into the phone with the steadiness of someone pouring water from a heavy pitcher. The clerk's message became a motion, the motion turned into an emergency order, the emergency became ordinary paperwork as soon as a judge's pen agreed that harm prefers daylight. I watched her work without decoration. She asked for a 30-day restraint on any transfer, sale, or encumbrance. She requested a requirement for accounting. She put my name where authority belonged. The room didn't cheer. It adjusted. We drove to the recorder's office because paper travels better with feet. The hallway smelled like toner and winter coats. Behind a glass pane, a woman with neat hair read the order once, then again, the way some people check a child's temperature with the back of a hand and then with the palm. She stamped the corner with a sound that felt like a gate locking. A man 2 windows down complained about a permit. Life kept happening in lanes beside ours. I breathed in the same air as everyone else and let that comfort me. Outside, Nina held the door like she'd been practicing for this all her life. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. We were not victorious, we were correct. It's a different weight to carry. By noon, the bank's elder team responded in writing. The pending transfer reversed like a tide that remembered shore. A phrase I'd never loved before became dear, provisional credit. It wasn't a trophy, it was oxygen. I forwarded the letter to the attorney, then printed a copy and slid it into the front of the folder because that's where good news belongs, visible, accessible, not flaunted. My phone filled with texts that performed different kinds of weather. A cousin wanted to check in, meaning gather gossip. A neighbor offered to bring a casserole, meaning she'd heard there'd been a fire and couldn't resist warming her hands near it. Mara sent 3 messages in a row, carefully spaced to look casual, variations of "we should talk," "you're being extreme," "this could have been handled privately." My father called once. He didn't leave a voicemail. Then he called again and said he wanted to reset. He said, "We all got carried away." I replied, "There's an order in place." He said, "No need to escalate." I answered, "Then abide." He hung up with a polite silence that tried to pass as grace. I put my phone face down and finished the second pot of coffee, alone in a kitchen that had learned my cadence. Mom was awake when I came home. She sat at the table with a magazine open to a page about perennials. Her finger traced the outline of a hosta like she was remembering where in the yard theirs had once fought the shade. I poured her tea and placed the cup where her hand would find it without pressure. She looked up like she'd been expecting me for exactly this moment. She said, "Was that the bank?" I replied, "It was." She nodded once, a small, satisfied note. She didn't ask for detail. She never pretended to love the boring things, she just trusted me to keep them from becoming emergencies. I cut an apple, arranged the slices in a circle, and we ate them like coins we were willing to spend. The afternoon became phone calls and scans and brief, gentle explanations to people who deserved them. The neurologist's office faxed a letter confirming what already lived in the margins of my days. The home care agency sent a revised schedule that respected authority without resenting it. Nina texted that the attorney had filed notice of revocation in service, and the clerk had recorded it. Paper updated reality, reality adjusted its shoulders. At dusk, Mara appeared on the porch without knocking. She stood with her hands tucked into the sleeves of a sweater that wasn't warm enough and wore the expression of a woman practicing repentance in a mirror. I opened the door because I had nothing to hide and no energy for dramatics on the landing. The smell of wet leaves came in behind her. She said, "We need to talk." I replied, "Not inside. Mom is resting." We sat on the top step like teenagers avoiding a parent, except we were avoiding what happens when adults decide to stop pretending. She started with the vocabulary of apology and then drifted quickly into the dialect of justification. Her sentences crowded the word just until it could barely breathe. She said she had meant well, that she had stepped in where there was a gap, that she had mishandled some logistics, and relied on advice that turned out to be less than sound. She frowned at the middle distance and let 2 tears hang where they would do the most work. I listened because listening is not surrender. When she paused, I let the pause expand until it had edges. I said, "You'll return the money today." She said, "I already did." I nodded. "You'll send the receipts by Tuesday." She bit her lip. "Some of them are cash. Then your accounting will show where cash is not acceptable." She stared at the street. A dog barked 2 houses down. The air smelled like someone starting soup. She said, "You always think I'm the bad one." I replied, "I think you avoid the boring things until they become easy to exploit." For a second, she let her face go bare. Underneath the bright curating lived the tired, frightened girl who cut grandma's roses into confetti because celebration was the only antidote she'd learned. I didn't feel triumph. I felt logistics. She said, "What do you want me to do?" I answered, "Stop signing. Start showing." She looked angry at being assigned a verb she didn't enjoy. She stood up like a decision had occurred, but it hadn't. She was staging a decision. She put her hands into her sleeves again, looked at the door behind me, and made her voice soft. She said, "I do love her, you know." "I know," I said, and meant it. Love is not a credential. It's a job. She left with a small sound, the step making that old, familiar complaint. I watched her go to her car and adjust her face in the mirror before turning the engine. She drove away like the person she preferred to be. The street swallowed the sound quickly. Inside, the house settled. I checked the locks and then checked the windows because care expresses itself in redundancies. I wrote a note on the fridge for the morning caregiver reminding her to use the blue mug for Mom's first tea, small habit, large comfort. I washed the knife I'd used for apples and placed it in the drawer, catching the familiar hitch, coaxing the slide. Domestic liturgy. It keeps rage from wearing the wrong clothes. The accounting arrived 2 days later, a PDF that wanted to be an alibi. It had the confidence of a student who learned to copy answers but not show work. Items labeled care included salon visits, meal deliveries my mother would never eat, and a charge from a boutique that specializes in dresses with dramatic sleeves. There were handwritten addendums in a different ink, notes about mileage and emotional labor. I printed it and wrote a neat column of questions in the margin. Then I sent it to the attorney without commentary. Commentary gives people a place to argue. Questions make them stand where they are. My father called once more. He used my full name the way people do when they're trying to climb an old ladder back into your good graces. He said, "Your sister is struggling." I replied, "We're all adjusting." He pivoted, tried for paternal authority, then abandoned it in favor of weather talk. Before he hung up, he attempted a final kindness. He said, "I'm proud of you, you know." I answered, "Then respect the order." He was quiet for a second and I could hear him calculating whether the pride cost more than the compliance. He settled for a vague promise. He has always settled for vague promises. The summons matured into a date. The attorney filed a petition for a formal guardianship before anyone could create another season of chaos. She crafted it narrow, finances and property only, with a review clause and a schedule for reporting. She said the court liked specificity. She said judges prefer daughters who bring lists rather than speeches. I wore a blouse without patterns and shoes that didn't click on tile. The courtroom felt like a school that had forbidden mischief. The judge had the face of a person who chooses soup on purpose. He reviewed the packet, asked 2 questions that mattered: was the revocation recorded, and did Mom have counsel of her own, and then turned to my mother's appointed guardian ad litem, who had visited the house promised in my pages. The guardian confirmed what anyone who'd eaten an apple at my kitchen table could have told them: Mom liked her chair by the window, the blue mug in the morning, and the daughter who remembered how to turn off the shut-off valve without bruising her wrist. The judge said, "Narrow guardianship granted." I replied to the room, not the man, "Thank you." Afterwards, in the hallway that smelled like floor wax and tired wool, Mara stood very still. She didn't touch me. She didn't perform. For once, she allowed the air between us to be the truth. She nodded like a soldier at a train station, then left before anything could be made sentimental. My father sat on a bench and looked at a spot on the floor like a man admitting he had not set the last post. The muffled gossip moved quickly through our small world. Neighbors became deputies of narrative. Some congratulated me like I'd won something. Some avoided eye contact, as if my calm were contagious. A cousin sent a long message about families being complicated. I sent back the thumbs up nobody is brave enough to hate. Then the USB-labeled video proved it contained a set of short clips. One was exactly what I expected, my sister's coaxing voice, framed by tenderness, asking for signatures like favors. Another surprised me, my father, weeks earlier, alone in the kitchen, flipping through the ledger he didn't know was being backed up, sighing the deep sigh of a man who understands the difference between stealing and taking and plans to use the ambiguity. And a third, older piece of video I didn't know existed, Grandma at the dining table, instructing Mom on where to keep the envelope with the notary seal, their hands touching on the paper like 2 birds sharing a branch. I watched it twice, then saved it to 3 places and wrote down where those places were. Insurance against narrative theft. The accountant, our attorney's recommendation, arrived with a portable scanner and the kind of patience that had learned to eat on the move. He sat at the table and asked simple questions that cut through thorn bushes: dates, amounts, names. He didn't glare. He reconciled. When he left, he squeezed my shoulder the way older brothers do in stories where older brothers are kind. He wasn't family. That helped. I found myself practicing generosity in new places. I allowed the caregiver an extra hour that wasn't billed because she'd sat with Mom through a confusing afternoon without making a mess of tenderness. I thanked the clerk again, not because gratitude would earn us future favors, but because people who put holds in place at the right moment deserve to know they adjusted a family's history by an inch that becomes a mile. I bought a plant for the attorney's receptionist. It was small. It fit on a windowsill. It had instructions a human could meet. On an unremarkable Wednesday, I took Mom to the river and we watched the water behave like law, powerful without bragging. She held my arm with a grip that told me she was here today and tomorrow was a different animal. A boy rode by on a scooter with a balloon tied to the handle. It bobbed like a red punctuation mark in a sentence full of weather. Mom pointed at it and laughed, the sound new and familiar at the same time. She said, "Do you remember when your grandmother tied balloons to the fence so the plumber would find our house?" I replied, "I do." She nodded, pleased with herself for retrieving that memory. She squeezed my arm twice. It was nothing. It was holy. Back home, I opened the shed and swept the floor because work never stops and should not aspire to. I tightened the hinges on the door to the laundry room. I labeled 2 more drawers for the caregiver's benefit. I put the index card that read "Start with Truth" into a new sleeve and taped it inside the pantry door at eye height. Then I made soup and ate it with Mom at the table where so many signatures had held or refused to hold. The steam curled like a slow blessing. Evening came with a small knock. The neighbor boy stood on the porch holding the locket Mara once borrowed without asking. He said they'd found it in their sprinkler box, years late, no explanation offered by the dirt. I washed it gently, dried it with a soft towel, and placed it in Grandma's jewelry box alongside rings that had waited without complaint. I considered texting Mara a photo, then didn't. Not everything needs to be turned into a lesson while it's still warm. The attorney emailed the final orders, recorded, time-stamped, serving completed. A calendar invite appeared for a compliance review in 3 months. I accepted it without thinking. The act felt like setting an alarm in a future I planned to reach. At night, when the house quieted to a pitch only Oldwood can hear, I allowed myself to understand the cost. I lay there and counted the seconds between the refrigerator's clicks. I listened to Mom turn in her sleep and settle. I thought about Mara's eyes on the courthouse steps and my father's hands on the table, palm down, trying to flatten what would not flatten. I felt tired in a way that wasn't dramatic, it was math. I also felt the shift. It wasn't victory. It was governance. The house had returned to speaking its own language, and I had learned again how to listen. The ledger no longer felt like a secret, it felt like a book in circulation, checked out to the person able to keep sentences from breaking. The next morning, a letter arrived, not certified, just ordinary. Inside, on heavy paper, was a note in my father's hand, square, unornamented. He wrote that he was stepping back and that he hoped we could leave the past alone. He enclosed the spare key to the storage unit I had already rekeyed. The gesture was either surrender or theater. I put the key in the drawer that sticks and wrote the date on a small piece of paper, then let it rest among birthday candles and emergency numbers. Some histories don't need confrontation, they need cataloging. By afternoon, the house cleaner returned a cardboard box I hadn't seen in years, discovered behind a stack of curtains in the attic, my grandfather's blueprints for the back porch, each line precise, each measurement proof that someone once built things by hand and believed they'd last. Tucked between 2 pages was a smaller drawing, informal, a draft of a garden path that never got laid. The pencil marks were smudged, the intention clear, a curve from the kitchen door to the shed, with stones at a distance my grandmother's knees could forgive. I took the blueprint to the table and weighed the corners with salt and pepper shakers. Outside, the light softened the way it does when a day considers keeping its promises. I traced the arc with my finger and felt the temptation to finish what he'd started. And then my phone chimed with a message I didn't expect, a short video from an unknown number, a shot of our front porch taken earlier that day, a hand, Mara's, leaving a flat parcel by the door, then walking away quickly, like a person who wanted to be seen and not seen. The parcel was nowhere in the hall now. I checked the porch, empty. The camera had caught something that had also learned to disappear. I stood very still, listening for footsteps that weren't there, measuring the air like fabric, and felt the house hold its breath again, not in fear, but in attention, as if it were reminding me that closure can have one more seam to finish before it sits right on the body that has to wear it. Some things don't vanish, they choose a different way to be seen. I stood in the hallway and let the house listen with me. The video still glowed on my screen, the soft wobble of porch light, the particular tilt of Mara's wrist when she sets something down, the quick retreat like she was outrunning a version of herself. 10 seconds later, the frame emptied to ordinary. I rewound and watched her sleeve brush the door jamb, the flat parcel settle like a patient animal, the edge catching light. When I stepped outside now, the boards were bare. The mat lay flush. The air smelled like rain making up its mind. I didn't chase the mystery around the block. I checked the simple things: mailbox, milk slot, the old copper shoe scraper my grandfather had bolted to the step. Nothing performed discovery. The neighbor boy wasn't on his bike, the caregiver had left an hour earlier with a wave and the grocery list. I opened the shed to make sure the key I'd kept in muscle memory was still the only one that mattered. The lock turned and the door gave with its modest, honest hitch. Inside, order remained itself. The green cash box slept under the shelf. The jars didn't blink. Back in the kitchen, I set the phone on the table and wrote down what I could know: time, angle, length of sleeve, the weather in the frame, dry boards, no gloss, so before the drizzle. The list steadied me. I could work with facts. Paper accepts facts the way the garden accepts weather, without enthusiasm, but effectively. Nina answered on the second ring. I didn't need to explain the house, she'd learned it by now. She said, "What do you want me to do?" I replied, "Nothing. Not yet." Silence is a tool when you don't make it into a weapon. We ended the call with the kind of goodbye that respects a person's capacity. I made tea. I set Mom's blue mug on the counter and put mine beside it. The kettle whistled like something eager to be useful. At night, I played the video again. I watched the frame of the door the way you watch a horizon line, not expecting rescue, calibrating your distance to the weather. I let myself imagine what had been in the parcel: apology, mischief, receipts, an heirloom, a test. Imagination is not evidence. I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where I store things I can't use yet. Morning came with the clean light that makes tile show every missed wipe. I wiped anyway. Mom ate toast with careful pleasure. I called the storage facility and confirmed no activity after our lock change. I called the attorney and left a note she would hear between court and coffee, a brief description, no panic, a request to flag any attempt to file by hand. Then I put on shoes that forgive standing and walked to the corner shop for onions and a box of coarse salt because recipes, like legal orders, depend on proportion. On the way back, the neighbor boy waved from his porch with a look I recognized, holding something he wasn't sure was his to hold. He said, "My mom says this was on our step." Wrong address? He held out a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper, the corner dark with a thumb's worth of damp. My name was on it in my sister's library loan handwriting, the "E careful, the rest a sprint." I took it with a thank you that cut wider than one delivery. I kept my face ordinary. I went inside and let the door sigh shut. I didn't open it standing. I set it on the table and washed my hands like a person about to handle new dough. I cut the twine with the kitchen shears that respect their job. Under the paper, a plain manila envelope appeared with a line of breathless text, "For safekeeping." Inside, a stack of receipts, wrinkled and flattened, some legitimate, some obviously not, a phone photo print of Mom and Mara in a doctor's waiting room, both looking at somewhere else, and at the bottom, something that made the air move, a handwritten note on Grandma's stationery, torn from the top of the pad, the faint emboss of the leaf still proud at the edge. It wasn't addressed. It didn't need to be. 3 sentences, blue ink, no flourish. Share the work or it won't be worth keeping. Don't call it help if it costs someone their sleep. If you forget, the path will show you. The path. I reached for the blueprint on the sideboard without thinking, the one with my grandfather's draft curve from the kitchen to the shed. A line drawn once and put away when life became a list of urgencies instead of additions. The pencil arc waited like a dare. I understood the shape of the next labor. I made a new list under the one about legal deadlines: stone, gravel, temp, level. I called the yard down by the river that still answers the phone like a person and ordered just enough to say intention out loud. The woman on the other end didn't try to sell me more than I needed. She said, "It'll come after lunch." It came earlier. 2 men moved like people who treat weight with respect. They unloaded without commentary. One of them nodded at the house in a way that told me he had watched places like this survive sharper weather. When they left, the gravel pile looked like a small moon in our driveway, the stones like a sentence broken into usable words. I didn't ask anyone for permission. I staked the curve with string and took the first shovel to the grass. The earth was still soft from the rain. It lifted clean. Mom watched from the window with her chin in her hand, the pose she used for crosswords when the answers wanted to play hard to get. I worked the line slowly, not to avoid fatigue, but because precision deserves the same respect as speed. By mid-afternoon, the trench had a shape the house recognized. I tamped the soil until it consented to hold the weight of something new. I spread the gravel in a layer that felt like sentence structure, a base so syntax could happen without collapse. The stones went in one by one, my knees remembering a different kind of prayer. Their weight spoke a language I trusted. The curve behaved. It had to, it had been waiting on paper for decades. Mara appeared at the edge of the yard as if the path had summoned her. She wore flats inappropriate for dirt, which felt right. She stood outside the gate with her hands in the sleeves of a sweater that had learned to keep its shape. For a long minute we looked at each other through a fence that had been repaired enough times to understand repetition. She said, "What are you doing?" I replied, "Finishing something he started." She looked at the blueprint on the porch table and then at the curve cutting the lawn into a gentler conversation. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't ask to be forgiven. She watched me place 3 stones and understood something about sequence. She moved toward the gate and stopped again like a person learning to respect thresholds. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, square object wrapped in a handkerchief, Grandma's old habit, copied without irony. She unwrapped it with fingers that had done this before and held out the locket, freshly cleaned, the hinge oiled, the chain safe. She said, "I should have put it back sooner." I answered, "You did now." She placed it in my palm and I felt the ridiculous heaviness of objects that refused to be just metal. I didn't put it on. I set it on the porch beside the blueprint like punctuation. Mara watched me fit 2 more stones, then she took a breath that bridged something. She said, "Show me." I made a space for the admission beside the trench. I handed her the tamp and let her find the rhythm of persuasion without force. She learned in increments. Her first placement wobbled. She adjusted. This is how the boring things bless us, they insist on corrections that make you a different person than you were when you began. We worked until the curve made sense to both our eyes. We didn't talk while we placed, words would have diluted the math. Mom tapped the window with her ring in a small applause and then disappeared, reappeared at the door with 2 cups of water balanced like an offering. She handed one to Mara without ceremony. Mara took it, startled by how easy inclusion can be when it's built, not demanded. We finished by late afternoon, knees soaked, palms raw the good way. The path lay there modestly, ready to lead and be stepped on. I swept the dust from the stones with the old straw broom that had outlasted 3 vacuums. The sweep made a music I didn't know I'd missed. The curve carried a person from kitchen to shed without punishing their bones. That was all it had ever promised. Inside, I set the manila envelope of receipts and the note on the table. I didn't let Mara see the video. Some evidence exists to correct the world, some exists to correct the person who made it, and doesn't need to be waved around afterward. She sat across from me, elbows tucked, thumb traveling a nervous path along the rim of her cup. She looked younger and older at once. She said, "I sent those before I could talk myself out of it." I replied, "Good." She nodded, then smiled, "Small, the kind you keep in your pocket until it might serve someone else." She stood to go without the flourish of a grand exit. At the door, she paused. She said, "Tell me what to do next." I answered, "Bring your planner. We'll divide the week." Her laugh surprised us both. It was not a performance. It was a release valve finding work again. She left with her head down, the way you carry something fragile under your hair. The next days behaved like life returning to itself, not because the storms were done, but because the roof held. The attorney sent a final note with checkmarks where there used to be open squares. The Guardian ad litem filed her report with comments about the blue mug and the path she noticed through the window. The bank's flag remained in place like a watchman who refuses to blink. My father mailed an apology on paper, the kind that could be filed and forgotten in the same motion. I filed it. Forgetting would be extra. I don't do extra. Mara came on Tuesday with her planner and a pen I recognized as stolen from a Pilates studio. We sat at the table with the calendar and carved the week into fair pieces. She took shower days, med checks, the Thursday afternoon walk when the river is least crowded. I kept the ledger, the bank, the pharmacy calls. We wrote our names in boxes that could be read by a person who didn't know either of us, and we put the paper on the fridge with the magnet shaped like an orange. Mom nodded at it when she passed, like a mayor approving a budget. We made a rule: if a thing takes less than 5 minutes, we do it without announcing it. If it takes more, we text and say so. If it costs money, we file it, not brag about it. If it costs pride, we swallow. This was our treaty, not performative, not punitive. The house absorbed it without creaking. Nina visited one evening and stood on the path with her hands on her hips like a builder visiting a site she had quietly saved by making a phone call at the right hour. She didn't take credit. She asked if the stones held. I said they did. We stood in companionable quiet until the porch light yawned on. Before she left, she pressed a slip of paper into my palm, an appointment card for a pro bono clinic she volunteers at twice a month. She said, "If a neighbor asks for help and you don't have hours left, send them here." I replied, "I will." This is another form of revenge I hadn't understood before, turning a family's near ruin into a public resource with a door and a schedule. Some victories are quiet because they aren't trying to humiliate anyone, they're trying to stop a pattern from relocating. On Sunday, I opened the shed and brought out the folding chairs. Mom wore a cardigan we had finally buttoned right. Mara brought a bakery pie she didn't pretend to have made. We sat at the bend in the path where the gravel whispered under our chairs, and watched starlings pretend to agree about direction. Mom held the locket in her palm, its warmth accumulating like a small, obedient sun. She asked me to open it. Inside, the tiny photos had been replaced, without fanfare, with 2 new, real ones I hadn't provided, Grandma at the table with the notary seal, and Mom at the window with her blue mug. The faces watched each other the way a pair of seasons sometimes do across a field. I closed it gently and fastened it around her neck, where it settled like a period at the end of a long, necessary sentence. Later, in the kitchen, I moved the index card that read "Start with Truth" from the pantry to the wall above the drawer that sticks. It was the truer address. I oiled the runners, coaxed them to an easier slide, wiped away the old tack of sugar that had crusted there during years when sweetness tried to do too much. The drawer closed with a sound that felt like a door satisfied with its hinges. Night came honest and cool. I wrote checks, logged payments, noted the good faith that had arrived through the mail from a sister who had followed directions she didn't enjoy, and went to bed with the rare sensation that being awake would not improve the world. The house breathed me under. In the pale blue before full morning, I woke to the soft clink of ceramic. Mom was in the kitchen, reaching high for the blue mug. I stood behind her and steadied the cup with one hand. She laughed. She said, "You always know." I replied, "It's my job." She drank, and we watched the steam write its disappearing letters. On the table sat the blueprint, weighted by salt and pepper. I took a pencil and drew a small, neat checkmark in the corner where the curve ended at the shed door. Done is a stronger verb than win. The parcel's brown paper lay folded in the recycling, the note lived in the fireproof box, the video slept in a cloud it didn't know was carrying it. The path wore our footprints, uncomplaining. The calendar on the fridge held our names in black ink, not the red we used for emergencies. The jar labeled surprises stayed empty, not because no surprises would come, but because I had learned to fund their consequences without drama. Before I left for the pharmacy run, I stepped onto the porch and felt for a moment that the house was watching me leave and return at once, like a person who knows the rhythm and waits for it. Across the street, the neighbor boy rode his bike in cautious arcs. He waved. I waved back. Down the steps, I paused. The shoe scraper glinted. A thin, flat shape leaned unnoticed against the lattice, maybe blown there by last night's breeze. I crouched. It was a photograph in a clear sleeve, uncreased, face inward. I slid it free and turned it over. 2 girls sat on these same steps, a summer 30 years earlier. One held a ledger in her lap like a book she was learning to read, the other, hair wild, knee scuffed, tipped a watering can with both hands, flood and precision in the same grip. Behind them, a woman's skirt swirled out of the frame, the hem brushing the top stair, a hint of supervision, not a claim. Someone had written on the back in a familiar square hand, "Keep both." I stood there with the porch under my feet and the photograph in my fingers and felt the last small seam pull tight, not into a knot, but into something that can carry weight. The street exhaled. The day prepared itself without asking my permission. I slid the photo into my pocket beside the brass key and started down the new path, the stones answering back in that quiet, competent way I have come to trust, ready for whatever work waits at the shed door.